Good evening and welcome to this special Workers' Party of Britain online meeting to celebrate Victory Day, the victory of the Allied forces in Europe against Nazi fascism. We're joined tonight by Joti Brar, Deputy Leader of the Workers' Party of Britain, and George Galloway, who will be speaking as Leader of the Workers' Party of Britain. So without further ado, Comrade Joti Brar.
Thanks very much for that. And a very warm welcome to all of you who are watching and listening this evening. I send you really joyful greetings on this occasion of the 75th anniversary of the victory over fascism in Europe. Very quickly, I'd like to just talk a little bit about the reason why we are celebrating today rather than yesterday. We are marking in particular the day that the Soviet Union always celebrated, which was the 9th of May rather than the 8th of May. And the reason for the date difference is quite interesting because in the Soviet Union, although the peace treaty had been signed a day earlier with the Germans, the Soviet leadership was very clear that Nazi commitments weren't really worth the paper they were written on. And until they actually saw physical surrender, they weren't prepared to declare the war over. And that didn't start to happen until the next day. And so on the 9th of May, the Soviet leadership said, yes, the Germans are surrendering their weapons to us en masse. I think there was one little pocket that was still holding out. And in that case, we can say truly, the war is over and we can declare victory in that war. So that's why the Soviet Union celebrated Victory Day on the 9th of May and not on the 8th of May as Western Europe celebrates VE Day. In Britain, we are rightly proud of the role that we played, British workers played, in the anti-fascist war. But with all due credit, we must also have a little humility in just how our cause was dwarfed by the contribution of the Union. The British and that as well as armed forces lost, I think, 400,000 lives. It's a lot of life to lose. It's a big loss, a tragic loss, and we remember it, deep scars in the nation's psyche. The Soviet people in that war took the brunt of the fascist forces. 9% of forces were on the front fighting in the Soviet Union, and the weight of Hitler's war machine was really directed against the Soviet Union for 3-4 years. And the Soviet Union lost partisans,
Oh dear, I'm afraid the connection seems to be very unstable, so we will just move on to George Galloway. So introducing Mr. George Galloway, Leader of the Workers' Party of Britain, to speak on the 75th anniversary of the victory over fascism.
Thank you very much, comrades of the Workers' Party, my fellow leaders, including Joti. I'm sorry about the unstable connection. I hope we can get her back later in the meeting. And greetings to all those who are not in the Workers' Party yet, members of the public from many countries who are watching and listening to this broadcast this evening. Now, it's partly because I was born so close to the end of the Second World War, just 9 years after the end of the war. And now that I know how quickly 9 years go by, I feel particularly close to the epic struggle of the Second World War. I was born in the very month when rationing was finally lifted in Britain after the end of the Second World War. Winston Churchill was the Prime Minister of Britain when I was born. That's how long ago it was. I grew up in a country, Scotland, which was still scarred by bomb damage. My earliest memories are of playing in the ruins of bomb-damaged houses and warehouses, and down by the docks in Clydebank in Glasgow. I had an Anderston shelter in the backyard of my slum tenement home, where 9 years earlier my ancestors would have had to scramble to avoid the raids of the German Luftwaffe. So when people say to me, don't mention the war, it's difficult for me not to mention the war. I feel that it has shadowed a considerable part, if not all, of my lifetime, and it shaped the world in which I grew up and became politically active, and shapes it still, a subject to which I shall return. Before going on to the main burden of my remarks, I want to expand on a rather popular tweet that I made yesterday, in which I opined that the so-called left, and I put that in inverted commas, had shown the British working class all over again over the preceding 24 hours exactly the contempt that they hold their own country in, exactly the condescension with which they view and look down upon the people of their own country. They're sneering, giggling, laughing at the ordinary people of this country, putting out their own national flag, having tea in their front gardens, and remembering the victory of 75 years ago. According to the literati and the sophisticated ones on social media, these people were knuckle-dragging Brexit mania Little Englanders. But of course, nothing could be further from the truth, because as Joti just said there before we lost her, the contribution that the people of this country made and the scars in their national psyche, the drain on their national resources. Now, I can't read this message. What does it say? Huh? There's no Q&A. I was being held up a poster, but I couldn't read it in the light. Please forgive me. So the point I'm making is that Britain made a very significant contribution to the victory which is being celebrated today, especially in that period, our finest hour, our darkest hour to our finest hour, when we stood alone with Hitler at the Channel ports, threatening to invade us, and when we had every reason to expect that the Nazi hordes that had charged across mainland Europe, whose armies folded like a tent before them, would be coming our way, and that we would have to fight them on the beaches, on the landing grounds, on the rooftops, from house to house, on the fields. And I believe that a significant number of our people were ready to do that. And so, if you think about it, if not for our stand, there wouldn't have been a Second World War as such, and it wouldn't have been the same Second World War, and it almost certainly would not have had the same outcome. If we had succumbed, if we had surrendered, as powerful circles in the British ruling class were beseeching and threatening Churchill to do, he and Attlee and Greenwood and Bevan all stood firm and said that we would never surrender. Now, of course, some would have surrendered. Some would have rushed out to sell services to the advancing Nazi hordes. That's in the way of things. But the great majority of patriotic British people from all classes would have resisted to the best of their ability. But the leading role of that resistance would have been in Britain, as it was in France, in Greece, in Italy, as it was across occupied Europe. The leading role in that resistance would have been played by people like us, the people whose color was red, the people whose allegiance was to the working class, and who recognized that fascism was the greatest danger to the working class movement. Indeed, no such movement could possibly have continued if the Nazis, if fascism had prevailed. Now, I want to deal with a couple of points that have been coming up on social media and also points which are particularly important to me. I want to deal, first of all, with how it was that the Nazi menace was allowed to grow and grow entirely illegally in breach of international law until it became the power that it was, subjugating all of Europe. And the reason for that is appeasement. The ruling elites in France and in Britain believed that appeasing Hitler, and if possible turning him to the east, turning him towards his arch enemy, the USSR, was the best way of handling this tiger. They did not seek to clip the claws even of that tiger, merely to turn that tiger in a different direction. And we had many opportunities. Time does not allow me to do justice to them all. The reoccupation of the Saar land, the rearmament, the remilitarization of parts of Germany that had been forbidden such militarization, the rearmament, the building of a Luftwaffe, the building of a massive naval fleet, the building of a submarine fleet, all of them illegal under the international law imposed at the end of the First World War, were all allowed to be done. The League of Nations did nothing. Fascist aggression by Mussolini in Abyssinia did absolutely nothing, worse than nothing, in the Hitler and Mussolini empowered, enabled fascist coup of General Franco in Spain. Indeed, if I was to identify a precise point at which it was possible to have stopped Hitler and Mussolini in their tracks, it would have been in the defense of the Spanish Republic. Instead, a policy of non-intervention was declared, which was, of course, a policy of intervention on the side of Franco, because Hitler and Mussolini were allowed to provide the air force, provide the soldiers, provide the armaments with which the fascists drowned Spain in blood. If Britain and France had come to the aid of the Spanish Republic, rather than leaving it to the advance guard in our finest hour as a labor movement, the advance guard of the International Brigade from all the countries of the world, if they had not left it to our grandfathers and grandmothers, if they had used their armed force to come to the aid of the Spanish Republic, Hitler and Mussolini could have been stopped, and the Second World War and the Holocaust itself could have been stopped. But there is an overarching theme here, and a number of people have asked me to deal with this point this evening, although they were handing me a boomerang that they themselves had thrown. So let me throw it back at them. There's, you know the old saying, a little knowledge is dangerous. There's a surprising number of people out there who think the important thing in this story is the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. Well, I'm going to talk to you about a pact which was concluded 11 months earlier, after Stalin had offered to send 1 million Soviet soldiers to defend the borders of Europe and had been spurned. A pact was drawn up between the British Prime Minister Chamberlain, the French Prime Minister Daladier, and Adolf Hitler at Munich. The Chamberlain-Hitler Pact, the Daladier-Hitler Pact, at which Czechoslovakia was handed to the Nazis and then rapidly dismembered and rapidly subsumed as other territories had hitherto been so. Nobody seems to know on social media that it was us that concluded a pact with Hitler, leaving Stalin absolutely no other option but to conclude the Ribbentrop-Molotov Pact 11 months after our pact with Adolf Hitler, because of course at that point it was abundantly clear that Britain and France had no intention of fighting Hitler under the appeaser governments, especially the Chamberlain appeaser government. And therefore the Soviet Union had to do what it could do to give itself territorial hinterland, to protect the motherland, and to rearm and reorganize the Red Army for the inevitable onslaught of fascism, which it fully expected and was preparing for. So we could have stopped Hitler. We could have allied with the Soviet Union. We could have destroyed fascism and Nazism long before 1939, and we should have done so. But we did not. And I've referred earlier to the gallant stand which we made alone against the beasts of fascism, who were only 29 miles away from landing on our shores. But our Royal Navy, and especially during the Battle of Britain, our airmen and women and our allies from Canada, Australia, from Poland and other parts of the world who had come here as the last free standing place that they could in order to enlist and to serve the anti-fascist cause. We can be proud of our country's role in the war. And there's nothing wrong with patriotism. There's nothing wrong with loving your own country. There's nothing wrong with loving your own compatriots. And it just shows how alien to the people of Britain so much of the so-called left has become, as they showed during the Brexit debate too. How alien, how foreign to their own country and to their own people they are, that they have been unable to acknowledge that, even in a celebration of the defeat of fascism and Nazism itself. But we will not allow history to be rewritten. The ultimate obscenity of Donald Trump tweeting yesterday that the United States and Britain had won the Second World War is so ludicrous it's almost a spoof, although it's difficult to tell the difference when Donald Trump is concerned. Nothing could be farther from the truth than that statement from the White House, not from Trump's own Twitter feed, from the White House Twitter feed today. But just in case you thought this was somehow a Trumpian aberration, let me tell you that the British Foreign Office produced virtually the identical lie yesterday morning in a video in which, but for a single frame of a single Soviet soldier, you would never have known that the Soviet Union had been in the war, let alone had been by far and away by a gigantic measure, the most important part of the victory 75 years ago this day. It was a British and American fake news propaganda offensive, which takes forward the same kind of revisionism, rewriting of history that the European Union has made its own life's work over the last period, because they cannot accept anything which shows Russia in a good light. They cannot accept even when the smallest smattering of scholarship by a schoolboy or schoolgirl demonstrates the truth that Joti was starting to adumbrate, that 4 out of every 5 Nazi casualties in the war were inflicted by the Red Army. 80%, 4/5 of all Nazi casualties were on the Eastern Front against the Red Army. 27 million Soviet citizens lost their lives in the war, an uncountable number wounded and maimed and damaged, enormous destruction of industrial capacity, agricultural capacity, the rape of the natural resources and basic commodities that were stolen from the occupied parts of the Soviet Union, the enslavement of millions of Soviet citizens as slave labor for the Nazi war machine, the pogroms of every Russian or Soviet Jew that the Nazis and their vile collaborators in the Baltics, in the Ukraine, elsewhere, any Jew that could be found was worked to death or worse, shipped on a train to the death camps later liberated by the Red Army, by the Soviet Union. They are airbrushing all of this out of the picture this weekend on Victory Day, and we will not allow them. And let me tell you this is the first Victory Day that we as a Workers' Party together have experienced, and it's a virtual one. But next May the 9th, the Workers' Party will lead a march to the Soviet War Memorial in Lambeth. And we'll do it every year, as long as I'm alive and long after I'm no longer alive, because we will never allow the great sacrifice, the great heroism, the victory of the Red Army ever to be forgotten, even if social media, Facebook has just banned the iconic picture of the Soviet soldier planting the Soviet flag above the ruins of the Reichstag in Berlin. Imagine. Talk about fake news. Maybe we should think ourselves lucky. Maybe next year they'll change that flag. Maybe they'll fly an American flag over the Reichstag as part of their rewriting of history. Well, we will have no part of that. We will not allow to go into the memory hole that our great alliance of Churchill, Roosevelt, and Stalin, our great wartime alliance of Great Britain, the United States of America, and the USSR was jointly responsible for ending the menace which would have destroyed all civilization in the world. This is not a small point. If we had not prevailed, no Jew would be left alive on the planet. No gypsy would be left alive on the planet. No mentally disabled person, or even physically disabled, would be left alive on the planet. No Slav would be left alive on the planet. No communist, no socialist, no trade unionist, no freedom of any kind would exist in the world if our wartime alliance had not prevailed. The ideals of fascism and Nazism would have been hegemonic, would have ruled the world, maybe until now. Maybe until now. Just ponder that. The sacrifice of the Soviet armies and people reached its apogee in the epic, the biggest, the greatest, the most heroic battle in all history, the Siege of Stalingrad, following on from the Siege of Leningrad, the Siege of Moscow, when at one point confined to the remains of industrial parks, factories, ruined factories, and warehouses, the Red Army fought on and on and on into the Soviet winter. And then, like Muhammad Ali and George Foreman and the rope-a-dope, the Red Army sprang forward, having suckered in von Paulus's Nazi brigades, divisions, hundreds of thousands of them, and then ensnared them in a pincer movement, in a bulge, which the Red Army would then squeeze until it collapsed. And then Kursk, the greatest tank battle in history, against the famous, infamous Panzer divisions. The Red Army again prevailed and continued to prevail all the way to Berlin. 80,000 Red Army soldiers, 80,000 died. Hundreds of thousands were wounded in the final assault on the lair of the beast. But the Red Army had become unstoppable. And therein lies the problem. You see, late in the war, the imperialist camp, which had hoped in the beginning that Hitler would destroy Bolshevism, dismember the Soviet Union, destroy it so that it could never rise again, now had to confront the fact that not only was the Soviet Union and its army unvanquishable on the battlefield, its reputation worldwide had grown to enormous proportions. And the imperialists were afraid that the victories of the Red Armies would inspire in France, in Italy, in Greece, maybe even in Britain, would inspire people like them to rise and eventually take power in our own countries, and that the red flag might not be kept beyond our borders. So the Cold War began. The earlier glamorization, lionization of Stalin and the Red Army and Zhukov and the great hero cities of the Soviet Union, that lionization turned to demonization. The imperialist camp had to demonize the Soviet leadership, its armed forces, its political and economic system, because they were scared that that would come here. And the older amongst you, I'm certainly one of them, were brought up in an era of Cold War where the Russian was other, where the Bolsheviks were just waiting to invade us. How we had to join together in a war alliance, NATO, bristling with nuclear weapons, how we had to plant in the 1980s short and medium range nuclear missiles on European soil in order to confront that Soviet Union. That shadow of potential nuclear conflagration was cast over the early life of many people watching this broadcast now, and it was all a lie. The Soviet Union had no intention and no capability of invading and occupying our countries. It was a lie used to oil the wheels of the military-industrial complex and the Cold War think tanks and politicians here in the West. Sure, socialism posed an existential threat to capitalism. That's why capitalism embraced for a short time the ideas of social democracy, welfare states, health services, pensions, benefits of all kinds, to forestall the possibility of socialism coming to our countries. And then when the Soviet Union ignominiously collapsed, that social democracy began to disappear in front of our eyes like snow off a dike, melting away as the perceived threat of an existential challenge dissipated, broke up in disaster. And that would have continued if Boris Yeltsin had remained in power in Russia. Then you would not be hearing any of these Russophobic madness that you hear every day in our media and from our politicians. Because Russia was lying drunk on the floor while the West was picking its pocket, stealing everything that the Russian people had built. Only with the rise of Putin and the steady, apparently inexorable recovery of national prestige and strength and wealth in Russia, the successor state to the USSR, has the balloon gone up again. Has NATO begun to advance to the very borders of Russia itself? Nuclear weapons on the borders of Russia itself. Well, I don't know about you. I don't fancy war with Russia. I don't fancy war with China. I don't fancy war at all. Because we glory to the Red Army does not mean we love war. We hate it because it's the working class who pay the highest price for war. As Stalin said, down with the arsonists of war. Arson is what war is, consuming human flesh and civilization and economic gain indiscriminately, voraciously. Down with the arsonists of war. Glory to the Red Army. Glory to the wartime alliance of Mr. Churchill, President Roosevelt, and Marshal Joseph Stalin. Glory to the victory we celebrate today.
Thank you, George, for that eloquent and moving tribute to the heroic sacrifice of the Soviet people in alliance with Britain, America, and the French resistance, as well as all the partisans across Europe. It will be a crime to forget their memory, and it'd be a crime to forget the past, because if we forget the past, we're doomed to repeat it. I'm happy to announce we have received Comrade Joti Brar, the Deputy Leader of the Workers' Party, back from her internet troubles, who will now be speaking.
Thank you, Dan, and thank you, George. A very hard act to follow. That was a really moving and beautiful speech, and covered a huge array of topics and things in relation to our subject today, and really reminds us what it is that we're doing here and why we're here. I wanted to come back to what I was saying when the internet gremlins cut me off, and that was about the falsification campaign. And George talked about it very eloquently. But, you know, even before the war was over, the lies began to be told about what had happened and who had fought and why and how. And that campaign went up a whole massive notch higher when the Soviet Union collapsed. Not only had we had the decades of Cold War propaganda before that, but those in the Cold War, propaganda was being refuted from the other side. When we came to the collapse of the Soviet Union, as George said, the prestige of socialism was in the dust, and the leaders of the former socialist countries were drunken sots making way for the rape and pillage of their countries and their people's wealth. And there was nobody standing up for the truth. And so the ruling class in the imperialist countries felt empowered, emboldened to really go on a massive offensive. And when I was first coming into the communist movement, I was going the opposite direction to most people. I joined the communist movement when everybody else had decided it was over. We had examples of things like Anthony Beevor started writing these horrendous books about World War II, where he would essentially try and explain away the victories of socialism as some kind of aberration that happened in spite of socialism, in spite of the terrible leadership, in spite of the terrible lives people were living. Somehow they managed to fight back. In fact, really, it was the Russian winter that did most of the fighting. Of course, these people can never explain why it was that the Russian winter selectively targeted only well-equipped, well-covered Nazi soldiers, and somehow left alone the Soviet soldiers, who apparently had terrible morale and no equipment, were starving, were being held with a gun to their head to go into the front lines, etc., etc. You know, the lies after lies after lies that come to try to explain away the Soviet victory. And in recent times, as George has pointed out, you know, the whitewashing of history that's going on right now, you know, this year we've seen the EU resolution that tries to say that the invaded Soviet people and their socialist system are equally culpable for the crimes against humanity as the barbaric fascist invaders. It is indeed an obscenity. The ruling class thinks it can get away with these obscenities because the working class is not yet organised enough to really push back and prevent them. And that's a weakness on our part that we must remedy. You know, we were told this year that Auschwitz was liberated by Ukrainians, the inference being that it was liberated by Ukrainian nationalists. Now, anyone who knows anything knows what a disgusting statement that is when the Ukrainian nationalists sided with Hitler and were facilitating the Holocaust. They were not liberating the concentration camps. It was the Red Army that liberated those concentration camps. And it's a really disgusting lie that the ruling class is telling, one of many. So they want us to believe that the USSR was victorious in spite of socialism. They want us really to forget that the Soviet Union ever took part in the war. Never mind that the Soviets won. And if we understand that they did win, they want us to believe that it was in spite of their leaders and in spite of their socialist system. But of course, the truth is exactly the opposite of that. The Soviets won because the socialist system had built them into a strong, well-educated, food-secure, technically advanced industrial power. They won because all of society's resources could be mobilized for the war effort as a result of socialist economic planning. They won because the people loved the socialist system that they had built by themselves, for themselves. They loved their leaders. They were prepared to die to defend what they had and what they had built. And socialism in the 20 years before the war had educated an entire generation, freed women, oppressed nations had been freed. They had built a huge industrial base. They modernized farming. They brought culture and dignity to the lives of workers. They raised up an entire people just at the time when all the rest of the world was being crushed under the weight of the Great Depression, which for everybody else seemed inescapable. Socialism gave people homes, jobs, dignity, security. It gave them the skills, the equipment, the knowledge that they needed for the fight against fascism, and most of all, it gave them a reason to fight. The Soviet people fought for the socialist motherland in defense of peace and progress and on behalf of all of humanity. And the Soviet victory in that war was the ultimate proof of the superiority of socialism and the planned economy over the barbarity and the anarchy of capitalist imperialism. And in capitalist imperialism in World War II, in that fight, was represented by the most extreme form of imperialism, where the democratic mask has been ripped away and you see the naked, brutal, terroristic dictatorship of fascism. These are the lessons our rulers want the workers of the world to forget. They want us to forget that socialism can be built. They want us to forget that it has been built. They want us not to understand that socialism is superior to capitalism when it comes to providing for the needs of the mass of the people. They want us to forget that socialism defeated fascism during World War II in the East as well as in Europe. They want us to believe that capitalists are the wealth creators and without them we'd be lost. But the history of the USSR, the history of World War II, proves exactly the opposite. That's why they're so desperate to hide it from us. The history of World War II proves that when the working class gets rid of capitalist exploitation and takes charge of production in the interests of itself, there's nothing that we can't achieve. There's no force that can stop us. So then it's clear why the ruling class lies to us, and we shouldn't really expect anything different. Their job is to try to stop us fighting for socialism, and our job is to do it anyway. Their job is to lie about our history in order to break our confidence in ourselves and destroy our unity. Our job is to hold fast to the truth, to spread it far and wide, to refuse to bow to the so-called mainstream narratives, to be proud of our class's achievements and to build a movement that will bring socialism back to Europe. So I'd like to end by saying, Happy Victory Day, comrades. Long live the memory of the pioneering Soviet people, their brilliant leaders, their socialist system, their brave partisans, and their gallant Red Army, Red Navy, and Red Air Force fighters who liberated Europe from the Nazi jackboot and saved the world from fascism. Let us never forget their sacrifice.
Beautiful.
Thank you to our Deputy Leader there, Joti Brar, giving another eloquent tribute to the Red Army. And just before we hear last words from George, I'd like to remind everyone to join us next Tuesday at 8 p.m. We'll be discussing the Workers' Party position Ireland. And you can find that on YouTube, Facebook and Twitter, all the usual channels. Or if you want to join in, participate in the conversation, register as a member of the Workers' Party. Go to workerspartybritain.org to sign up and you can join us in that discussion. Over to you, George.
Thank you, Daniel, and thank you, Joti, for a wonderful address. We'll be touching on this subject again tomorrow night on the Mother of All talk shows. available on all good networks, starting at 7 p.m. And as Dan said, we'll be back on Tuesday with my weekly talk, this time on Ireland, where we stand. And I hope you'll join us on both of those occasions. I'd only make a few closing remarks. The first is that when I went to the Soviet War Memorial in Lambeth today, just about every person in the park was Russian. And I'm not talking about oligarchs. None of them were oligarchs. Working class Russians were the people who were there at the park to pay their tribute to the great victory today. Many of them wearing the wonderful colors and emblem of St. George, the patron saint. I quite like that patron saint because it's my namesake and because I like to slay dragons, and the ultimate dragon was slain by the Russian people, by the Soviet people 75 years ago this day. And the second point is to accentuate what Daniel said when I'd finished speaking, and I realized I hadn't done so significantly enough, and that is to talk about the victory of the partisans. The song Bella Ciao, wonderfully sung by a friend of mine in Glasgow, just for me. She made it today. Christine Beauville is her name, a wonderful rendition. Bella Ciao became the anthem of all the partisans of the world. And these partisans were operating behind enemy lines, under enemy occupation. Some of them, like the French, were able eventually in 1944 to be joined by the invading British and American armies. Some of them, like the Yugoslav partisans, were able to liberate their own country, Albania too. They were, all of them, in all of these countries, just like they would have been here. People from all classes, no point in obfuscating that fact, but the leading edge, the leadership, the fighting force, the steel of the Maquis, of the Partigiano, of the resistance fighters, were all people like us. So in saluting the victory of the British, American, and Soviet armed forces, we honor also the enormous contribution, incredible bravery, huge sacrifice of the partisans of the resistance under fascist occupation. Thank you very much indeed for watching tonight. Thank you, Daniel, for organizing it. See you on the Mother of All talk shows tomorrow, God willing.